It was just supposed to be a weekend away on the farm, a way for us to relax, enjoy some fresh air, and get away from the stresses of everyday life. My husband John and I had been married for 5 years, and I thought we were doing just fine. In fact, everything seemed perfect. He had a good job, we had a comfortable home, and even though life wasn't always exciting, we were content. Then came the phone call. It was Greg, John's best friend. They'd known each other since high school, and Greg had been a part of our lives for as long as I could remember. He called up out of the blue, inviting us to spend the weekend on his farm. Now, Greg wasn't just any friend. He was the kind of guy you could rely on, the one you'd call if you needed help. He was dependable, down to earth, and always had a way of making people feel at ease. That's what made the invitation so simple. It was Greg after all. No one would have suspected anything odd. But I remember feeling a little weird when he mentioned how quiet the farm was now that his wife had taken the kids to visit her parents for the weekend. It was like he was almost trying to convince us to come, like it was going to be just the 3 of us. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but for some reason I felt this small unease. Maybe it was just my imagination. After all, we were just going for a couple of days. What could possibly go wrong? John was excited. It'll be fun. We haven't had a chance to relax in ages. Plus, Greg said he's got some new stuff around the farm we can check out. That sounded harmless enough, so we packed up and headed out early that Saturday morning. The drive was peaceful, and by the time we arrived, the countryside had worked its magic. Quiet, fresh, and perfect for unwinding. Greg was there to greet us when we pulled up. His grin was wide and his handshake firm, just like always. There was something reassuring about him, the way he made everything seem simple, even though I knew he had his own share of troubles. Still, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I smiled and hugged him, trying to push away that lingering feeling I couldn't quite place. The moment we stepped into Greg's farmhouse, it felt like we were a world away from our normal lives. The house was cozy, with old wooden floors and a large stone fireplace in the center of the living room. The place was decorated with a rustic charm, antique furniture, vintage farm tools hanging on the walls, and warm, earthy tones. It was charming, and you could tell Greg had put a lot of effort into making it feel like home. We sat down to lunch, and the conversation flowed easily, as it always did when Greg was around. We caught up on the latest news, talked about old friends, and laughed about memories from the past. There was nothing about the afternoon that screamed anything out of the ordinary, but somehow I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. John was his usual self, relaxed, enjoying the easy pace of the farm. He always had a way of letting his guard down around Greg. Something about their friendship that made him feel comfortable, maybe even a little too comfortable. I didn't think much of it at first, but now that I look back, maybe that was the first sign. After lunch, Greg suggested we go for a walk around the property, just to show us the new improvements he'd made. I agreed, but I noticed that John was more interested in checking out the barn, something he'd never cared about before. It was just another little detail, but in that moment, it made me feel like there was some kind of unspoken energy between Greg and me. Greg led the way, and I followed, trying to push the feeling of unease aside. The farm was beautiful, fields stretching out in all directions, a small pond in the distance, and the sound of birds chirping. Everything seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. We walked in silence for a while, Greg pointing out new animals he'd acquired and telling me about his plans for the property. It wasn't until we reached the edge of the woods that things began to shift. We stopped by a small bench near the trees, and Greg sat down. I was standing next to him, looking out over the land, when he suddenly turned to me. His eyes were different, like there was something more behind them. I didn't understand it at first, but it hit me then. I was suddenly aware of how close we were, too close. I stepped back, but he reached out and touched my arm gently. The moment lingered, and I could feel my heart beating faster. Something in my gut told me this wasn't just a friendly gesture, but I still didn't know what to think. Before I could react, John's voice called out from the barn in the distance, snapping me back to reality. Greg quickly withdrew his hand, and we both stood there awkwardly for a moment. "Let's head back," he said, his tone a little too casual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted. I didn't know what it meant, But I knew that whatever was happening between Greg and me couldn't just be ignored. Later that evening, we sat around the dinner table, enjoying the warmth of the fire and Greg's homemade stew. I tried to push the strange moment from my mind, but I couldn't. There was a heaviness in the air, something between us that hadn't been there before. I felt tense, and I noticed Greg kept stealing glances at me when he thought I wasn't looking. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I just smiled and kept eating, pretending like everything was fine. The conversation turned to wine, and Greg suggested we have a glass or two to relax. I was hesitant, but John was all for it. "It'll be fun," he said. "We never get a chance to unwind like this." So we poured ourselves some wine, and the evening started to feel a little lighter. But as the hours passed, I began to feel a little more than tipsy, and that's when things started to change. Greg became more charming, more flirtatious, and I couldn't ignore the way his eyes lingered on me. I could see the way he looked at me differently now. The tension between us was palpable, but I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the alcohol, but deep down I knew it wasn't. John, of course, was oblivious. He'd had a few drinks himself, and by this point, he was talking about some work stuff with Greg, completely unaware of the dynamic that had shifted between us. As the night wore on, I could feel the space between Greg and me closing. We were sitting closer, and I couldn't ignore the heat in the air. My heart raced a little faster with each passing moment, and I felt like I was losing control of the situation. But it wasn't until Greg's hand brushed mine, just a casual touch, as if it was an accident, that I realized I wasn't imagining anything. He knew exactly what he was doing, and so did I. But what was I supposed to do now? After that touch, everything changed. I could feel it in the way Greg moved around me, the way he spoke to me with a deeper tone, almost as if he was trying to draw me in. And I'm not going to lie, I was starting to feel something. Something that I shouldn't have been feeling. I kept telling myself that I was just overthinking it, that maybe it was the wine or the weird dynamic of the farm that was messing with my head, but deep down I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was happening between us. As the night went on, the three of us moved to the living room, and Greg put on some music. He made us all another round of drinks, and we all just sat there chatting about old times. But every time I glanced at Greg, there was this look in his eyes that made my skin crawl and heat up at the same time. I tried to ignore it, but it wasn't easy, and when John got up to get more firewood, it was just Greg and me sitting there alone. I couldn't believe it when Greg leaned in closer. His voice was low and soft. "You know," he said, "you look beautiful tonight." My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure how to react. Was he serious? Was he joking? I forced a smile and said something about the firelight playing tricks on him, but he didn't laugh. Instead, his gaze lingered a little longer than it should have, and I could feel the heat radiating off his body. It wasn't just the compliment. It was the way he said it, like it meant something more. I felt myself getting lost in the moment, my thoughts racing as I wondered what he really wanted. "I've always thought you were beautiful," Greg continued, his voice even quieter now, "but you've always been with John. I respect that. I just sometimes wonder what it would be like if things were different." I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and I felt a flush creep up my neck. Was he really saying what I thought he was saying? Was he really implying something more than just a compliment? My mind was spinning, but before I could gather my thoughts, John came back into the room, interrupting the moment. Greg quickly straightened up, and I pretended like nothing had happened. But my heart was racing. I could feel the electricity in the air, and I knew that nothing was the same between us anymore. John didn't seem to notice anything. He sat down and started talking about some new project he was working on, completely unaware of the tension that was hanging between Greg and me. I tried to focus on what John was saying, but all I could think about was the way Greg had looked at me and the words he had said. My mind was a mess, and I didn't know how to make sense of it all. The next day, things didn't get any better. In fact, they only got worse. I couldn't stop thinking about what Greg had said the night before. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that it was just a fluke, that maybe I had misinterpreted his words, but deep down I knew what had happened. Greg had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure if I could just forget it. We spent the day outside, walking around the property, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg was watching me a little too closely. Every time I turned around, his eyes were on me, and it made my stomach turn. I tried to stay focused on the task at hand, but I couldn't help but feel like I was on edge, like something was about to happen, and I didn't know how to stop it. We were in the barn, helping Greg with some work when it happened. John was off to the side, fixing something on the tractor, and Greg and I were alone for a few minutes. I should have taken that as a sign to walk away, but I didn't. And that's when Greg moved closer. He stood behind me, his breath warm on the back of my neck as he reached over me to grab a tool from the shelf. Froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the tension building between us. This was it, the moment I had been dreading. I could feel his hand brush against my arm, and for a second, it felt like everything around us disappeared. There was just him and there was just me. And for a brief moment I considered letting it happen. I could have turned around, kissed him, and let whatever was between us unfold. But then, just as quickly, reality hit me like a ton of bricks. What was I doing? What was I even thinking? I pulled away quickly, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I should go check on John, I stammered, barely able to get the words out. But Greg didn't move. He stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable, before nodding silently. And as I turned to walk away, I couldn't help but feel like I had just escaped something. Something that could have changed everything. But that wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. Later that evening after dinner, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the fire. The house was quiet, and John had gone to bed early, leaving Greg and me alone once again. I didn't want to be alone with him, but somehow I felt like I had to be. There was a part of me that wanted to know the truth. I needed to know if what had happened in the barn was just an accident or if it meant something more. Greg came into the room and sat down across from me, his eyes intense. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. I felt my heart drop. I knew this conversation was coming, but I wasn't ready for it. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to make things weird between us, but I need to be honest with you. I can't stop thinking about what happened in the barn earlier." I looked at him, trying to keep my composure. "Greg, we can't. This isn't right," I said, my voice shaking slightly. But he shook his head, cutting me off. "I know it's not right, but that doesn't change the way I feel. I've always respected you, and I've never wanted to do anything that would hurt you or your marriage, but when I'm around you, I can't help it. There's something about you, something that I can't ignore." I didn't know what to say. I could feel my heart racing, and for a moment, I wondered if this was the part of the story where everything fell apart. "Greg, we can't do this," I whispered. "It's not just about me. It's about John too. I love him, and this would ruin everything." He looked at me for a long moment, and then his expression softened. "I don't want to ruin anything, I swear. But I need you to know that I care about you more than just as a friend." I could feel my chest tightening, my head spinning. What was I supposed to do now? How could I walk away from this? How could I forget what he had just said? The night after Greg's confession, everything felt different. It felt like the world had shifted on its axis, and I was left trying to find my footing in a place I didn't recognize. Barely slept. My mind was racing a mile a minute, replaying the conversation in my head over and over. How had we gotten here? What was I supposed to do now? The worst part was that despite everything, there was a part of me that understood what Greg was saying. I wasn't blind to it. I felt the connection too. There was something about the way he looked at me, something about the way he made me feel that I hadn't experienced in a long time. But I had a husband, had a life, a stable, predictable life. And I wasn't ready to throw that away for a fleeting moment of passion. Or maybe it wasn't just about passion. It was about something deeper, something that scared me more than I was willing to admit. But as much as I wanted to tell Greg to leave, to walk away and never bring it up again, I couldn't. There was something in his eyes that made me feel like if I shut him down too hard, I'd be closing the door on something I might never get back. It was stupid, I knew that, but in the heat of the moment I was unsure of where the line was. The next day, the tension was unbearable. Every time I looked at Greg, my stomach churned, and every time I looked at John, I felt like I was lying to him. It was a constant war between my loyalty to my husband and the magnetic pull I felt towards Greg. We were outside, John and Greg working on fixing a fence while I cleaned up around the barn. I could hear their voices in the distance, laughing and joking like nothing was wrong, and I felt like I was suffocating in the space between them. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell Greg that it couldn't happen, that I couldn't betray John like this, but part of me wondered if I already had. As the day wore on, Greg seemed to grow bolder. Every time he passed me, his hand brushed against mine or he'd make some comment about how great I looked. I started to wonder if he was doing it on purpose. Was he trying to push me into something? Did he want me to make the next move, or was it just his way of testing the waters to see how far he could go? I tried to ignore it, but it wasn't easy. And when we sat down to lunch, it became impossible to ignore. We were eating outside under the shade of a large tree. John was talking about a new project he had at work, but I couldn't focus on anything he was saying. All I could think about was Greg sitting next to me, his leg accidentally brushing mine under the table. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had to force myself to swallow the food in my mouth to act normal, but the air felt thick, and the tension between us was palpable. I couldn't breathe. Finally, Greg broke the silence. "You're so quiet today," he said, looking at me with that same intense gaze. I forced a smile, trying to cover up the storm of emotion swirling inside me. "I'm fine," I replied, but my voice sounded strained, even to me. I couldn't look at him anymore. I couldn't bear it, but I also couldn't move away from him. It was like I was stuck, trapped in this moment. I didn't know how to get out of it. John looked at me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "You okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "Yeah," I said quickly, trying to smile. "Just tired, I guess." Greg's eyes flicked between John and me, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. I couldn't figure out what he was thinking, but in that moment, I felt like he knew something I didn't. Felt exposed. I felt like everything was about to unravel. That evening I couldn't take it anymore. I was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained from all the tension, from trying to act normal when everything in me was screaming to just run, to get away from Greg and his unspoken intentions. I went to bed early, hoping that sleep would clear my head, but of course it didn't. Instead, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day over and over. At some point I must have drifted off because I woke up with a start, hearing a soft knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could be knocking at this hour? I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. Before I could even move, the door opened slowly, and there stood Greg, looking down at me with a mixture of hesitation and determination. My stomach dropped. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room, "but I can't stop thinking about you." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. What was happening? Was this really happening? Was Greg really standing there in my room saying this? "I know it's wrong," he continued, taking a step closer, "but I need to know if you feel the way I do, because if you do, I can't just pretend like nothing's going on between us." I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of how to react. Part of me wanted to scream at him to leave, to run, to protect what I had with John. But another part of me was tempted to just let go, to see where this feeling between Greg and me could take us. Before I could say anything, Greg stepped closer, and his hand reached out to touch my face, his fingers brushing against my cheek. My breath hitched, and I couldn't move. He was so close now, so close that I could feel the warmth of his body against mine, and all I could think about was how much I wanted to kiss him, how much I wanted to see where this would lead. But then I heard a noise. The unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the room. It was John. Greg quickly stepped back, his face flushing with embarrassment. I jumped to my feet, my mind racing. This wasn't happening. This couldn't happen. I rushed to the door, pulling it open just as John rounded the corner. He looked at me, his eyes confused. "Everything okay?" he asked, looking from me to Greg, who was now standing awkwardly by the bed. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. This moment had just changed everything. The next few moments felt like they lasted a lifetime. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at John, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and panic. What had just happened? What was I supposed to do now? John looked at me, then at Greg, and for a brief moment, the tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I could see the questions in his eyes, the suspicion creeping in, but he didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly, almost as if he was giving me a chance to explain myself, but also waiting for me to do something that might prove he was right to trust me. "John," I began, but my voice caught in my throat. What could I possibly say? How could I explain that I had let myself be swept away in a moment of weakness, that I had let Greg get so close? But John didn't give me the chance to finish. "It's fine," he said softly, his voice calm but distant. I'm just going to go get some water. I'll be right back." With that, he walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by an even stronger feeling of dread. What had just happened? Why had Greg come in here in the first place? And why hadn't I stopped him? I turned to face Greg, whose eyes were wide, his expression unreadable. "You should go," I said quietly, my voice barely a whisper. This isn't right. You can't be here." Greg nodded slowly, his face a mix of regret and frustration. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I shouldn't have done that. I needed to know if there was something between us. I thought maybe you felt it too." "I don't know what I feel," I replied, shaking my head. "But I know that I can't do this. I can't hurt John. I can't hurt our marriage. It's not worth it. It never was." Greg didn't say anything. He just looked at me for a long moment before turning and walking out of the room, leaving me standing there, a tangled mess of emotions. I closed the door behind him and sank down onto the bed, my head in my hands. I couldn't believe what had just happened. One moment I was questioning everything, and the next I was left with nothing but guilt and confusion. How could I have let this happen? Why had I allowed myself to get so close to crossing that line? The sound of John's footsteps returned, this time coming down the hall to my door. I wiped my eyes quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed how shaken I was, but I knew I couldn't hide this. I couldn't lie to him. Not now, not after everything that had happened. John knocked softly before opening the door. His eyes were soft, but there was an edge to them, like he was waiting for something. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, standing in the doorway. "I didn't mean to make things weird. I guess I felt like I needed to check on you." I stood up, meeting his gaze. My heart was heavy with guilt, but I knew that if I didn't tell him the truth now, it would only get worse. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice shaky. "There's something I need to tell you. Something that happened with Greg." His face softened, and he stepped closer. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't know how to say this, but I almost crossed a line with Greg tonight. He came into my room and I didn't stop him. I didn't tell him to leave, and I don't know what I was thinking, but I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." John's face paled as I spoke, and I could see the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal that was already starting to form. But he didn't yell. He didn't explode. He just stood there, silent for a long moment, as if trying to process what I had just said. "You almost crossed a line," he repeated, his voice quiet. "What does that mean exactly?" "You mean you were about to." I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "No, John. Nothing happened. Nothing physical. But he came in and he said things that made me question everything, and I let him get too close. I let it go too far." John didn't say anything for a while. He just stood there, his arms crossed, his gaze distant. The silence between us stretched on, unbearable, thick with unsaid words. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but cutting. "I can't believe this," he whispered, almost to himself. I trusted you. I trusted you both, and you let him in like that. I'm sorry, I whispered again, choking on my words. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I love you, John. Please believe me. But even as I said those words, I could see the doubt in his eyes. The trust was gone. I could feel it slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to fix it. The damage had been done, and nothing, not even my sincerest apologies, would be enough to erase what had almost happened. John walked to the door, his back to me. He didn't look back as he spoke. I don't know if I can look at you the same way after this. I need some time. We both do. And with that he left. I stood there, alone in the silence, feeling like the weight of the world was pressing down on me. I had lost everything. My marriage, my peace of mind, and it was all my fault.